She stays with you for 5 months. I'm not a damn jailer. You sleep in the barn with the animals.
Flint Ridge, Arizona Territory, late October, 1881. The wind came down hard that evening. Not the kind of wind that whispered through the grass or rustled the leaves. This was the kind that clawed at the skin, carried dust like broken glass, and smelled of dying things, dried grass, cracked earth, something rotting somewhere beyond the ridge. The sky was bruised, purple, streaked with red where the sun bled into the horizon. It was the kind of sky that promised cold, the kind that made animals burrow deep and men check their stores of firewood. Hale Mercer stood on the porch of his ranch house, arms crossed over his chest, jaw tight as iron, watching the column of riders approach through the scrub and rock. He had known they were coming. The messenger had arrived 2 days ago, a kid barely 18 trembling as he'd handed over the sealed letter. Hale had read it once, crumpled it and thrown it into the fire, but burning paper didn't make the words go away. Hostage placement. Treaty protocol. 5 months. Non-negotiable. Now they were here. Hale counted them as they rode closer. 8 riders, U.S. cavalry by the look of the uniforms, dusty blue coats, brass buttons dull in the fading light. Their horses moved slow, deliberate, like a funeral procession, and in the center of the column, hands bound, sat a girl. Hale's stomach twisted. He told himself it was anger, told himself it was the insult of being forced into this, of having his land turned into a prison, his life into a leash for someone else's war. But beneath the anger was something sharper. Grief. 3 months ago, his younger brother Ethan had died in his arms. Hale could still feel it, the weight of Ethan's body going slack, the warmth of blood pooling in the dirt, soaking through Hale's shirt, staining his hands red. He could still hear Ethan's voice, broken and faint, whispering something Hale couldn't make out. Hale. She sang, and then nothing. The raid had been sudden, brutal. They'd been escorting a supply wagon through the canyon when the arrows came. Apache arrows, the officers said. Apache vengeance for some slight Hale didn't even know about. Hale had believed it. He had carried that belief like a stone in his chest ever since, heavy and cold, pressing down on his lungs until some days he could barely breathe. Now the U.S. cavalry was at his gate, and they had brought him one of them. The riders stopped 20 feet from the porch. Dust swirled around the horses' legs, and the animals snorted and stamped uneasy. The girl sat on a brown mare, her hands bound in front of her with rough hemp rope. Her wrists were raw, rubbed red where the fibers had chafed the skin, but her head was high. Her long black hair was pulled back with a strip of leather tied tight at the base of her neck. A few loose strands moved in the wind, brushing her cheek, but she didn't reach up to fix them. She couldn't. Her hands were tied. She wore a deerskin dress, simple and plain, dusty, and torn at the hem. It had once been beautiful. Hale thought, carefully stitched, decorated with small beads along the collar. But now it was stained with dirt and sweat and something darker. Blood, maybe. Around her neck hung a necklace of turquoise stones, vivid blue against her brown skin. The stones caught the last of the daylight, gleaming like pieces of the sky. Her eyes were fixed somewhere beyond the horizon, as if the men around her didn't exist. As if Hale didn't exist. She didn't look afraid. She didn't look like a prisoner at all. She looked like a queen being escorted to a throne she didn't want. The captain dismounted first. Elias Crane. Hale recognized him immediately. They'd served together once years ago, back when the uniform still meant something. Back when Hale had believed in duty and honor and protecting the innocent. Before he learned that the uniform protected nothing but lies. Crane was older now, thicker around the middle, his face lined and hard. His uniform was wrinkled, his boots scuffed, but his eyes were the same, cold, calculating, sharp as a blade. Mercer Crane said, tipping his hat. His smile didn't reach his eyes. It never did. Hale didn't return the greeting. He just stood there, arms crossed, waiting. Crane's smile thinned. Still not much of a talker, I see. Hale didn't respond. Crane sighed and gestured toward the girl. This is for you. What's this? Hale's voice was flat, emotionless. Hostage, Crane said as casually as if he were talking about livestock. Part of the new treaty. Apache chief's daughter. Name's Nizhoni. Means beautiful. He smirked. Fitting, don't you think? Hale's jaw tightened. He looked at the girl again. She still hadn't moved. hadn't looked at him. Her gaze was distant, unreachable, like she was looking at something only she could see. She stays with you for 5 months, Crane continued. You keep her alive, keep her here, and the tribe keeps the peace. Simple. I'm not a damn jailer. Hale said, his voice low and hard. Crane shrugged. You're the closest ranch to the border, and you've got reason to want this treaty to work. He paused, letting the words sink in. Don't you? The words landed like a punch to the gut. Ethan. Hale's hands curled into fists. His nails bit into his palms, but he didn't feel it. All he felt was the rage rising in his chest, hot and bitter, choking him. 5 months, Crane repeated. Then she goes home. If she dies or if she runs, the whole thing falls apart. War starts again. Blood on both sides. You want that? Hale's throat was tight. He couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. Crane took his silence as agreement. He nodded to one of his men, a younger soldier with a nervous face and shaking hands. The soldier dismounted, walked over to the girl's horse, and pulled a knife from his belt. The girl flinched. Just a little. Just enough to show she was human. The soldier cut the rope around her wrists, and it fell away, landing in the dust. The girl rubbed her wrists, slowly wincing as the blood rushed back into her hands. But she didn't say anything, didn't thank the soldier, didn't look at him. The soldier helped her down from the horse. She stumbled slightly when her feet hit the ground, as if she'd been riding for days and her legs had forgotten how to hold her. But she straightened quickly, pulling herself upright, her chin lifted. She stood there in the yard alone, surrounded by men who saw her as a problem to be solved. And still she didn't look afraid. Crane mounted his horse again, settling into the saddle with a grunt. He looked down at Hale, his expression unreadable. She's your problem now, Mercer, he said. Don't screw it up. He gave a lazy salute, turned his horse, and rode off. The other soldiers followed their horses, kicking up clouds of dust as they disappeared into the growing dark. And then there was silence. Hale and Nizhoni stood facing each other in the fading light. The wind had died down, but the cold was settling and creeping across the land like a living thing. The first stars were beginning to appear in the bruised sky, faint and distant. Hale looked at her, really looked at her. She was young. Maybe 20, maybe younger. Her face was smooth, unlined, but her eyes were old. She had seen things, he realized. Hard things. Things that aged a person from the inside out. Her hands were calloused, rough from work. Her shoulders were straight, her posture strong. She didn't look like someone who had been broken, but there were bruises on her arms, faint and yellow, healing, and the raw skin on her wrists told a story Hale didn't want to think about. She looked at him with dark, steady eyes. No fear, no pleading, no begging for mercy. Just nothing. It made him angrier. He wanted her to be afraid, wanted her to beg, wanted her to give him a reason to hate her the way he hated all of them. But she just stood there silent, and still like a stone in the middle of a river. Hale felt the rage rise in him, hot and bitter, filling his chest until he thought he might explode. This girl, this Apache girl, her people had killed Ethan. Her people had taken the only family he had left and ripped it away, leaving Hale alone in a world that had stopped making sense. And now she was standing in his yard on his land, looking at him like he didn't matter. His voice, when it finally came, was low and cold as winter. You sleep in the barn, he said, with the animals. She didn't flinch. Didn't blink. She just looked at him, her eyes unreadable, and nodded once. Then she turned and walked toward the barn, her steps slow, and measured her head still high. Hale watched her go. And when she disappeared into the shadows, he turned and walked back into the house, slamming the door behind him so hard the walls shook. Inside, the house was dark and cold. He stood there in the silence, breathing hard, his fists still clenched. On the table sat a photograph in a cracked wooden frame. Ethan, smiling, young, alive. Hale looked at it for a long time. Then he poured himself a drink and sat down in the dark alone. Before we continue, drop a comment with the number 1 if you think they'll ever make peace. Let's see what you believe. Weak, one stone in silence, Hale did not speak to her. He left a bowl of water outside the barn each morning and a piece of bread at night. He didn't look at her when he did it. He didn't want to see her face. The routine was mechanical, cold. He set the bowl down like he was feeding a stray dog, not a human being. And each time he told himself it was enough. She was alive. That was all the treaty required. Nizhoni took the water, drank it slowly, and set the bowl back down without a word. She didn't thank him. She didn't beg. She simply existed like a shadow at the edge of his land, moving quietly through the hours as if she had learned long ago that survival meant silence. But Hale noticed things he didn't want to notice. The way she cupped the water in her hands before drinking as if it were something precious. The way she tore the bread into small pieces and ate them one at a time, making the meal last. The way she never wasted a single crumb. On the second morning, he saw her kneel by the barn door and press her palm flat against the dirt, her lips moving in what looked like a prayer. When she stood there was a dusting of red earth on her fingers, and she touched it to her forehead before going inside. Hale turned away, his jaw clenched. He didn't want to understand her. He didn't want to see her as anything more than a reminder of what he had lost. On the third day, she tried to take an apple from the kitchen. Hale saw her through the window, her hand reaching toward the wooden crate near the door. She moved carefully, as if she knew she was trespassing, but hunger had made her bold. He was outside in seconds. He slapped the apple out of her hand. It hit the dirt and rolled. "Don't ever come into my house," he said, his voice low and cold. She looked at him unblinking. Her face showed nothing. No anger, no shame, just a quiet, terrible stillness. Then she turned and walked back to the barn. Hale stood there breathing hard, his hand still stinging from the slap. The apple lay in the dirt between them, bruised and covered in dust. He didn't pick it up. That night it rained. The storm came in fast, the kind that turned the sky black and made the earth smell like iron. Lightning cracked across the horizon, illuminating the ranch in sharp, violent flashes. Thunder rolled like cannon fire. Hale sat inside, whiskey in hand, listening to the rain hammer against the roof. The barn roof leaked in 3 places. He knew because he'd been meaning to fix it for months. He heard the water dripping from inside the house, saw the flicker of lightning through the window, and imagined her sitting in the dark, soaked, shivering. He took another drink. He imagined her huddled in the corner, her arms wrapped around herself, rain dripping through the cracks above her head. He imagined her face calm and unreadable, even as the cold seeped into her bones. He turned away from the window and poured himself another drink, but the image wouldn't leave him. Around midnight he stood and walked to the door. He grabbed an old tarp from the shed, threw it over his shoulders, and stepped out into the rain. The mud sucked at his boots as he crossed the yard. The barn door was open, a crack swinging in the wind. He pushed it wider and looked inside. Nizhoni was sitting against the far wall, her knees pulled to her chest, her hair plastered to her face. Water pooled around her, dripping steadily from the holes in the roof above. She didn't look up when he entered. She didn't move at all. Hale stood there, the tarp heavy in his hands. He should have thrown it to her. He should have turned and left. Instead, he walked forward and draped it over her shoulders. She flinched just slightly, as if his touch had startled her. Then she looked up at him, her dark eyes wide and searching. Hale didn't say anything. He turned and walked back out into the rain. When he woke the next morning, the tarp was folded neatly by the barn door. By the 4th day, Hale stopped leaving the bread on the ground. He didn't say anything. He just set it on an upturned crate near the barn entrance where it wouldn't get dirty. And he added a second piece. Nizhoni noticed. He could tell by the way she paused before taking it, her fingers hovering over the bread as if she were trying to understand the gesture. But she didn't thank him, and he didn't expect her to. On the 5th day, he saw her mending the fence. She had found a coil of old wire in the shed and was twisting it around a broken post, her hands quick and sure. The work was careful, precise, better than he could have done. Hale watched from the porch, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. When she finished, she stepped back and tested the post with her hand. It held. She didn't look at him, but she knew he was watching. That evening, when he brought her water, he found a small pile of firewood stacked neatly outside the barn door. It hadn't been there that morning. He looked at the wood, then at the barn, then back at the wood. His throat tightened. He didn't say anything, but the next morning he left her a blanket. By the end of the first week, Nizhoni had stopped looking at him altogether. She moved through the chores he didn't assign, feeding the horses, collecting eggs, sweeping the barn floor. She worked as if the ranch were hers, as if she belonged there. Even though she slept on the ground and ate scraps, and had nothing but the clothes on her back. Hale watched her from a distance, his chest tight with something he refused to name. Guilt, maybe, or something worse. She just stood there, breathing in short, painful gasps. Hale checked her over, lifting her hooves, examining her mouth, pressing his ear to her chest to listen to the rattle in her lungs. But he didn't know enough about sickness in animals to do much more than guess. He was preparing to saddle another horse and ride into town for the veterinarian when he saw Nizhoni. She was kneeling beside the mare, her hands moving gently over the animal's neck, her touch light and careful. She pressed it gently against the mare's chest and throat, her fingers spreading the mixture in slow, deliberate circles. and then she began to sing. It was soft rhythmic, a melody that rose and fell like breathing. The words were in a language Hale didn't understand, but the sound of it was ancient grounding like the voice of the land itself. "What the hell are you doing?" he demanded, his voice sharp. She looked up at him, her expression calm, helping. Hale wanted to pull her away, to shout, to tell her she had no right to touch his animals. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way the mare's breathing seemed to slow, or the way Nizhoni's hands moved with absolute certainty, as if she had done this 100 times before. He stepped back. "If she dies," he started. "She will not die," Nizhoni said simply, and she went back to singing. For 2 days, Nizhoni tended the mare. She didn't ask for Hale's permission. She simply worked quiet and steady, applying the paste every few hours, singing those low, haunting songs that seemed to soothe the animal. Hale watched from the barn door, arms crossed, jaw tight. He told himself he was keeping watch, making sure she didn't make things worse. But the truth was he couldn't look away. On the second evening, Nizhoni brought fresh water to the mare and coaxed her to drink. The animal's breathing was already clearer, her eyes brighter. She nuzzled Nizhoni's hand, and Nizhoni smiled. It was the first time Hale had seen her smile. It changed her face completely, made her look younger, human. He turned away, his chest tight. On the third day, the mare stood. Hale was carrying feed across the yard when he heard the whinny. He dropped the sack and ran to the barn. The mare was on her feet, her head high, her breathing clear and strong. She walked to the edge of the stall and nosed at Nizhoni's hair as if to say, "Thank you." Nizhoni laughed. It was a soft, quiet sound, but it echoed in the stillness of the barn like a bell. Hale stood frozen, staring at the two of them. The mare was alive, because of her. That evening he found Nizhoni sitting outside the barn, her back against the wood, her eyes on the stars. The night was clear and cold, the sky scattered with light. She had wrapped the blanket he'd given her around her shoulders, and her breath misted in the air. Hale stood a few feet away, unsure of what to say. For a long moment there was only silence. Then finally he spoke. "Thank you." His voice was rough, uncertain. It had been so long since he'd said those words to anyone. She didn't look at him, but her lips moved just slightly. "You are welcome." Hale swallowed hard. He wanted to say more, to ask her where she had learned to heal, how she had known what to do, why she had done it at all. But the words stuck in his throat. So instead he turned and walked back to the house, leaving her alone beneath the stars, and for the first time since she had arrived, he didn't pour himself a drink. Month 2, fire and arrows. The bandits came in the night. Hale woke to the sound of hooves and shouting. He grabbed his rifle and ran to the window. 4 men on horses circling the barn, torches in hand. "Come out, Mercer," one of them yelled. "We know you got supplies in there." Hale swore and kicked open the door, firing a warning shot into the air. The men scattered, then regrouped laughing. One of them threw a torch onto the barn roof. The wood caught instantly, flames licking upward into the night. Hale's heart stopped. Nizhoni was inside. He ran toward the barn, but one of the riders cut him off, swinging a club that caught him across the shoulder. Hale went down hard, the rifle skittering out of reach. The man dismounted, grinning. "Guess you ain't so tough." The arrow took him through the thigh. He screamed and collapsed. Hale looked up. Nizhoni stood in the doorway of the barn, flames behind her, a bow in her hands. Her face was calm, focused. She knocked another arrow and loosed it in one smooth motion. It hit the second rider's horse, spooking it into a wild buck. The rider fell, and the others turned and fled into the dark. The fire was spreading fast now. Nizhoni dropped the bow and ran to the water trough, filling a bucket. Hale scrambled to his feet and joined her, and together they threw water onto the flames until the roof hissed and smoked, and finally died. When it was over, they stood side by side, covered in soot and ash, breathing hard. Hale looked at her. She had saved his life. "Why?" he asked, his voice hoarse. She met his eyes for the first time in weeks. "Because you are not the enemy," she said quietly. "Only a man who does not know it yet." Month 3, the song. Hale couldn't sleep. It was the anniversary of Ethan's death. 3 years to the day. 3 years since he'd held his brother's broken body in his arms, felt the blood soak through his shirt, heard the last rattling breath leave Ethan's lungs. 3 years, and the wound still felt fresh. He sat on the porch with a bottle he didn't open, staring at the dark hills. The whiskey gleamed amber in the moonlight, but he hadn't touched it. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because drinking wouldn't bring Ethan back. Maybe because he was tired of drowning. The night was still. No wind. No sound except the distant call of an owl and the creak of the porch boards beneath his boots. He closed his eyes and let the memory come. 3 years ago. Ethan had been 12, just a boy, too young to be caught in the crossfire of men's wars. They'd been escorting a supply wagon through the canyon when the arrows came. Hale had pushed Ethan down, covered him with his own body, but one of the arrows had found its mark anyway, slipping between Hale's arm and Ethan's ribs. By the time the raid was over, Ethan was dying. Hale had carried him to the shade of a rock, held him close, pressed his hand over the wound, even though he knew it was useless. Ethan's eyes had been wide scared, searching Hale's face for some kind of answer. Am I gonna die, Hale? No, Hale had lied. You're gonna be fine. But Ethan had known. Kids always knew. His breathing had grown shallow, his skin pale and cold. And then just before the end, he'd smiled. It was a strange, distant smile, like he was seeing something Hale couldn't. There was a woman. Hale, he'd whispered. His voice so faint. Hale had to lean in close to hear. She found me. Before you came, she sang to me. It was so beautiful. Hale had thought it was delirium, fever dreams. But now, and then he heard it. Singing. Soft, low, rhythmic. Coming from the barn. Hale's eyes snapped open. His heart began to pound. He stood slowly, the bottle forgotten, and walked toward the sound. The barn door was open a crack. Golden light from a lantern spilled out into the darkness. Hale pushed the door wider and stepped inside. Nizhoni was sitting beside the mare, her hand resting gently on the animal's neck. Her eyes were closed, her face peaceful, and she was singing in a language that moved like water over stone fluid, ancient, sacred. The melody was simple, haunting, and achingly familiar. Hale froze. He had heard this song before, not with his ears, but in his memory. In Ethan's voice, broken and faint, describing something he couldn't name. She sang to me, so beautiful. Hale's knees buckled. He reached out, gripping the barn wall for support, his hands shaking. The song continued, soft and endless, wrapping around him like a blanket. It wasn't a song of joy. It was a song of sorrow, of loss, of remembering the dead. Nizhoni's voice rose and fell, each note carrying weight, carrying grief, carrying love. And Hale understood. This was the song Ethan had heard. This was the song a stranger had sung to a dying boy in the dust. Nizhoni stopped singing. She turned and saw him standing there, his face pale, his eyes wet. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The silence between them was vast, fragile, like glass about to break. Then Hale spoke, his voice barely a whisper. My brother, he heard that song. Before he died. Nizhoni's expression softened. She stood slowly, brushing the dust from her skirt, and walked toward him. She stopped a few feet away, close enough that he could see the firelight reflected in her dark eyes. This song, she said gently, is for those who have lost. We sing it when someone leaves us, when the spirit walks on and the body stays behind. Her voice was quiet, reverent. I sing it for the mare who grieves her foal, but I sing it for you too. Hale's breath hitched. His chest felt tight, like something inside him was breaking open. You, he started, his voice cracking. You were there. You sang to him. Nizhoni's eyes filled with sorrow. She looked down at her hands, then back at him. I do not know if it was me, she said softly. Many of my people passed through that canyon. Many tried to help the wounded even when they were our enemies. Because a child is not an enemy. A child is only a child. Her words landed like stones in still water, rippling outward, shaking everything Hale thought he knew. He had hated her people, blamed them, believed they were monsters who killed without mercy. But here she stood telling him that one of them, maybe her, maybe someone like her, had knelt beside his dying brother and sung him into the next world. Hale covered his face with his hands, and for the first time in 3 years he wept. The sobs came hard, wrenching, ugly. He didn't try to stop them. He couldn't. All the grief he'd buried, all the rage he'd swallowed, all the nights he'd spent staring at the bottom of a bottle, it all came pouring out at once. He sank to his knees, his shoulders, shaking his breath, coming in ragged gasps. Nizhoni didn't touch him. She didn't speak. She simply sat down beside him, cross-legged on the barn floor, her hands folded in her lap, her presence steady and calm. She didn't try to comfort him with words. She didn't tell him it would be okay. She just sat there silent and still letting him break. Minutes passed. Maybe hours. Hale didn't know. When the tears finally stopped and the night grew quiet again, he lowered his hands and looked at her. She was still there. Her face was soft, patient, free of judgment. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice hoarse. She tilted her head slightly. "For what for? Everything. For hating you. For blaming you." For his voice broke. "For treating you like you were nothing." Nizhoni nodded slowly. "I know." She didn't say she forgave him. She didn't say it was all right. She just said, "I know." And somehow that was enough. They sat together in the barn for a long time after that, the lantern burning low, the mare sleeping peacefully in her stall. Hale didn't know what to say, didn't know how to put into words what he was feeling. So instead he asked, "Will you sing it again?" Nizhoni looked at him surprised. "The song," he said quietly. "For Ethan. Please." She studied his face for a moment, then nodded. She closed her eyes, took a breath, and began to sing. The melody filled the barn, soft and sacred, a prayer for the dead and the living both. And Hale listened. His eyes closed, his heart heavy, but no longer broken. For the first time in 3 years, he let himself remember Ethan, not with anger, but with love. Month 4 building. Something new, expanded version. The days grew warmer. Spring crept across the land, turning the brown grass green, coaxing wildflowers from the hard earth. Hale and Nizhoni worked side by side now. It started small. A shared task here, a quiet gesture there. He taught her how to mend the fence posts with nails instead of wire, showing her how to set the wood square and drive the nails in straight. She taught him how to set traps for rabbits using woven grass, her hands quick and sure, as she bent the reeds into clever loops. They didn't talk much, but the silence between them was no longer heavy. It was comfortable, easy, like two people who had learned they didn't need words to understand each other. One afternoon, Hale came back from checking the fences to find a small loaf of cornbread sitting on the kitchen table. It was golden brown, still warm, and it smelled like honey and smoke. He stood there staring at it, his heart beating a little faster than it should. Nizhoni was outside, hanging laundry on a line she'd strung between 2 posts. She didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge what she'd done. Hale sat down, broke off a piece of the bread, and tasted it. It was sweet, dense, rich with wild honey and something else. He couldn't name some herb or root that made it taste like the land itself. He ate it slowly, savoring every bite. When he finished, he walked outside and found her folding a blanket. "That bread," he said. She looked up, her expression neutral. He smiled. It felt strange on his face, like a muscle he'd forgotten how to use. "Better than my ma's," he said quietly. Nizhoni's lips curved just slightly. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close, and it made something warm bloom in Hale's chest. Another day by the creek, Hale saw her trying to rebraid her hair. The leather tie had broken and her fingers fumbled with the long, dark strands, trying to weave them back together. She looked frustrated, tired. Hale walked over and crouched beside her. "Let me," he said. She hesitated, her hands stilling. Then slowly she turned her back to him and sat. Hale's hands were rough, calloused, clumsy. He'd never braided hair before, but he tried. He gathered the strands carefully, dividing them into 3 sections, weaving them over and under the way he'd seen his mother do once years ago. His fingers caught on knots. The braid was uneven, crooked, but he didn't stop. When he finished, he tied it off with a thin strip of leather he'd cut from his own belt. Nizhoni reached back and touched the braid, her fingers light and testing. Then she closed her eyes and let out a soft breath. "Thank you," she whispered. Hale's throat tightened. He nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "You're welcome." That night, frost came early. Hale woke to the cold seeping through the cracks in the walls, felt the chill in the air, and knew without looking that it would be worse in the barn. He got up, grabbed a blanket from the foot of his bed, and walked outside. The world was silver, and still the ground glittering with frost. His breath misted in the air. He crossed the yard to the barn and pushed the door open. Nizhoni was asleep, curled on her side, her arms wrapped around herself. The thin blanket he'd given her weeks ago was pulled tight, but it wasn't enough. He could see her shivering even in sleep. Hale walked over quietly and draped the second blanket over her shoulders. She stirred but didn't wake. He stood there for a moment, looking down at her, and felt something shift inside him. Not pity, not guilt, something else, something he didn't have a name for yet. He turned and walked to the barn door, intending to leave, but then he stopped. He looked back at her, small and cold and alone, and he couldn't do it. He couldn't walk away. So instead, he sat down against the barn door, his back against the wood, his rifle across his lap. Keeping watch? When Nizhoni woke in the morning, the frost had melted and the sun was warm on her face. She sat up confused and looked around. Hale was asleep sitting against the door, his head tilted back, his face peaceful. He had stayed the whole night. Nizhoni pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and smiled. Captain Crane returned on the last day of the 5th month. The sun was high and merciless, bleaching the land white. Hale was in the barn brushing down the mare when he heard the hoofbeats. Slow. Deliberate. The sound of a man who had all the time in the world. He stepped outside, shading his eyes against the glare. Crane rode in alone, his uniform dusty, and creased, his hat pulled low. But his expression was cold, sharp, like a knife pressed to skin. He reined in his horse and dismounted with the easy confidence of a man used to being obeyed. "Mercer," he said, nodding once. His voice was flat, emotionless. Hale didn't move. Crane looked past him toward the barn where Nizhoni stood in the doorway. She had been working, her hands were dusty, her hair pulled back, but now she stood still, watching. Crane's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Time's up, Mercer," he said. 5 months. Contract's done. I'm taking her back. Hale's jaw tightened. He stepped forward, placing himself between Crane and Nizhoni. "The treaty says 5 months," Hale said slowly. "It's been 5 months. She's free to choose." Crane laughed. It was a short, ugly sound. "Free." He shook his head. "She's a hostage, Mercer. She doesn't get to choose. That's not how this works." "She does now." Crane's smile vanished. His hand drifted toward the gun at his hip, his fingers brushing the handle. "You really want to die for an Apache, Mercer?" His voice was low, dangerous. After what they did to Ethan, the name hit Hale like a fist to the chest. His breath caught. His hands curled into fists. But before he could speak, Nizhoni stepped forward. Her voice was steady, clear, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Your brother did not die by Apache hands." Crane's face went still. The color drained from his cheeks. Hale turned to her, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. What Nizhoni didn't look at him. Her eyes were locked on Crane, fierce and unblinking. "I was there," she said. "I saw the man in the blue coat. He shot into the wagon from behind. He wanted the rifles you carried. He wanted gold. He wanted war." Her voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "He did not care who died. Not your soldiers, not your brother, not my people. He only cared for profit." Hale's blood turned to ice. His vision narrowed, tunneling until all he could see was Crane's face. "You," his voice was barely a whisper. "You killed." Ethan Crane didn't answer. For a long moment there was only silence. Then Crane's hand moved. He drew his gun fast, smooth, practiced. But Nizhoni was faster. The arrow was already knocked. She had been holding the bow loose at her side, hidden in the folds of her skirt, and now she lifted it in one fluid motion and loosed. The arrow sang through the air. It struck Crane's wrist, punching clean through tendon and bone. He screamed a raw animal sound, and the gun fell from his hand, clattering into the dust. Hale didn't think. He just moved. He crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and slammed into Crane, driving him to the ground. They hit hard, dust exploding around them, and Hale's fist connected with Crane's jaw once, twice, 3 times. Crane tried to fight back, swinging wildly, but Hale was stronger, angrier, fueled by 3 years of grief and rage and guilt. "You killed him, Hale," roared, his voice breaking. "You killed my brother." Crane spat blood. His face was a mess of cuts and bruises, his eyes wide and desperate. "It wasn't," he gasped. "It wasn't supposed to. He wasn't supposed to be there." Hale hit him again, and again, and again, until Crane went limp, until his breathing was shallow and ragged, until Hale's knuckles were split and bloody, and he couldn't see through the tears streaming down his face. When it was over, Hale sat back, breathing hard, his chest heaving. His hands were shaking. His whole body was shaking. Nizhoni knelt beside him, her hand light on his shoulder. "It is finished," she said softly. Hale looked down at Crane's unconscious body, then at his own bloody hands. "He killed Ethan," he whispered. "All this time it was him." Nizhoni nodded. "Yes. And I." His voice broke. "I blamed your people. I hated you. You did not know," Nizhoni said gently. "Hatred thrives in the dark. But now you see the truth, and the truth will set you free." Hale closed his eyes. The weight of the past 3 years pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. But beneath it he felt something else. Relief. Grief. and something that might have been hope. Two of Crane's men arrived an hour later, drawn by the sound of the gunshot that had never been fired. They found Crane bound and bloody, still unconscious, tied to the porch post. Hale told them everything. Nizhoni stood beside him, silent and steady, her bow still in her hand. The men looked at each other. One of them spat into the dirt. "We had our suspicions," the older one said quietly. "About the captain, about where his money came from." He looked at Nizhoni, then at Hale. "We'll take him in. Let the fort decide what to do with him." They loaded Crane onto his horse and rode off, leaving Hale and Nizhoni alone in the fading light. That night they sat together on the porch, watching the stars come out. Hale's hands were bandaged. His knuckles ached. But his chest felt lighter than it had in years. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "your people will come for you." Nizhoni nodded. "Yes, you'll be free." "Yes." Hale looked at her. The firelight from the lantern cast shadows across her face, softening the hard lines of her jaw, making her look younger, gentler. "What will you do?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. She looked out at the dark land, at the hills silhouetted against the sky, at the endless stretch of earth and stone. Then she said, "I do not know yet." Hale's throat tightened. He wanted to ask her to stay, wanted to tell her that she didn't have to go back, that she could choose this place, this life, but the words stuck in his throat. So instead he just nodded, and they sat together in silence, watching the stars, until the night grew cold and the fire burned low. Epilogue: The Choice. The Apache riders came the next morning. Hale saw them from the porch, a line of horses moving slowly across the plain. There were 10 of them, maybe more, their silhouettes, dark against the rising sun. He stood, his heart pounding, and walked down to meet them. Nizhoni was already outside, standing in the yard, her hands folded in front of her. She wore the same deerskin dress she'd arrived in, patched and mended now, but still hers. The turquoise necklace gleamed at her throat. The riders stopped at the edge of the property. One of them dismounted. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face lined with age and sun. His hair was gray, pulled back with a strip of leather, and he carried himself with the quiet authority of a man used to leading, Nizhoni's father, the chief. He walked forward, his eyes on his daughter. "Nizhoni," he said. His voice was deep, gentle. "Father," she replied, bowing her head. The chief looked at Hale. His gaze was sharp, assessing. "My daughter is free now," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Hale nodded, unable to speak. His throat was too tight. The chief turned back to Nizhoni. "Come, your people await." Nizhoni looked at Hale. Their eyes met, and for a moment the world seemed to stop. Then she walked toward her horse. Hale felt his heart crack. She was leaving. She had to leave. This was always how it was going to end, but then she stopped. Her hand rested on the horse's neck, but she didn't mount. She stood there still and silent, as if she were listening to something only she could hear. Then she turned and looked at Hale. "5 months ago," she said, her voice steady but soft, "I was brought here as a prisoner." The riders shifted, murmuring among themselves. Nizhoni ignored them. Her eyes were on Hale. "I was brought here in chains by men who saw me as a tool, a weapon, a way to keep the peace." She took a step forward. "But I learned something here. I learned that home is not where you are born. It is not the land of your ancestors or the place your mother sang you to sleep. Another step. Home is where you are seen, where you are known, where you are loved." Her voice broke just slightly on the last word. Hale's breath caught. Nizhoni reached up and unclasped the turquoise necklace from around her neck. She held it in her hands for a moment, looking down at it, then walked to her father and placed it gently in his palms. "Forgive me, father," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But I have found where I belong." The chief looked down at the necklace, then at his daughter. His eyes were sad, but there was no anger in them. Only understanding. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing her cheeks. "You are my daughter," he said quietly. "You will always be my daughter, no matter where you choose to walk." He kissed her forehead, then pulled her into a long, tight embrace. When he released her, he looked at Hale. "Take care of her," he said, "or I will return." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Hale nodded, his voice rough. "I will." The chief mounted his horse. The riders turned and began to ride away, back toward the horizon, back toward the hills. Nizhoni stood in the yard watching them go, her hand pressed to her chest. Hale walked up beside her. For a moment they just stood there, side by side, watching the dust settle. Then Hale held out his hand. Nizhoni looked down at it, then at him, and she took it. Her hand was small, warm, rough from work, but it fit perfectly in his. She smiled, not the small, fleeting smile he'd seen before, a real smile. Full and bright and free. Hale smiled back, and the ranch on Flint Ridge was no longer silent, because love like spring always finds a way to grow even in the hardest ground.